What if I told you the player who was supposed to save an entire league almost became its biggest problem? Not because she wasn't good enough, not because she couldn't handle the pressure, but because the moment she stepped onto that court, everything changed faster than anyone was ready for. We're talking about Caitlin Clark, the most talked about name in women's basketball. A player who didn't just enter the WNBA, she forced it into a completely different reality overnight. Sold-out arenas, record-breaking viewership, and ticket prices exploding. A level of attention the league had never seen before. But here's where things get strange. Because instead of a celebration, instead of a smooth transition into superstardom, what followed looked more like resistance. Hard fouls that didn't feel normal. Tension that didn't feel random. Decisions that didn't quite make sense. And then one move that left fans completely stunned. She wasn't just challenged. She was tested and pushed, and maybe even quietly pushed back against. But the real twist, the same system that seemed to reject her would later have no choice but to recognize her. So the question isn't just what happened to Caitlin Clark. The real question is, was this all part of the game? Or was something much bigger going on behind the scenes? Because once you start connecting the dots, the story becomes a lot more complicated than anyone expected. And it all started the moment she entered the league, and nothing went the way it was supposed to. When Caitlin Clark was drafted number 1 overall, it didn't feel like a normal draft pick. It felt like a turning point, not just for the Indiana Fever, but for the entire WNBA, because this wasn't just a talented college player making the jump to the pros. This was a phenomenon, a player who had already shattered records, dominated headlines, and pulled in viewership numbers that most professional leagues could only dream about. Before she even played her first WNBA game, she had already changed the business side of the sport. And you could see it immediately. Games that used to be played in smaller arenas were suddenly being moved to larger venues just to handle the demand. Tickets that were once easy to grab became almost impossible to find. And everywhere she went, the energy was different. Louder, more intense, more curious. It wasn't just fans of women's basketball showing up anymore. It was everyone. Casual viewers, new fans, and people who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives. All tuning in for one reason: Caitlin Clark. And for a moment, it looked like everything was going exactly how it was supposed to. This was the perfect story. A generational talent arrives. The league grows. Everyone wins. But then the tone started to shift subtly at first, almost in ways you wouldn't notice unless you were really paying attention. Because while the crowds were getting bigger, the atmosphere around her was getting colder. The excitement from fans didn't always match the reactions inside the league. And that's where things started to feel different. Because instead of a warm welcome, there was a sense of tension. Not loud, not obvious, but definitely there. You could see it in the way games were being played. Defenders weren't just guarding her, they were pressuring her. Every possession felt heavier. Every movement felt contested, and every mistake felt magnified. Now, to be clear, this is professional basketball. It's supposed to be tough. Rookies are supposed to struggle. That's part of the process. But this felt like something else because it wasn't just about stopping her from scoring. It felt like a message was being sent. A message that said, "You're not just going to walk into this league and take over." And the more games she played, the clearer that message became. The physicality wasn't just intense, it was constant. Every drive into the lane came with contact. Every off-ball movement came with bumps. Every screen came with extra force. It was like every opponent had the same goal. Not just to beat her, but to test her, to see how much she could take, to see if she really belonged. And the strange part is it wasn't just happening in one game or against one team. It was everywhere. Different opponents, same energy. And that's when fans started to notice, because the narrative that was supposed to be about a rookie rising to the top started turning into something else. A story about resistance, a story about pressure, a story about what happens when someone arrives too fast and changes too much all at once. And while all of this was building, while the tension kept growing, while the games kept getting more physical, there was still a belief that this was just part of the adjustment, that eventually things would settle down, that the league would stabilize, and that the storyline would return to what everyone expected. But then something happened that made it impossible to ignore anymore. One moment, one play, one hit that didn't just change the game. It changed the entire conversation. And once that moment went viral, there was no going back. At first, it was easy to brush it off. A hard foul here. A rough defensive possession there. A rookie getting tested. That's normal, right? That's what everyone said. That's what the analysts repeated. That's what the veterans hinted at. This is just how the league works. Welcome to the pros. Reality is different here. And for a while, people accepted that because they wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that what they were watching was just competition. Nothing more, nothing deeper. But then came the moment that changed everything. Not gradually, not subtly, instantly. It happened during a heated game. The kind where emotions are already high, the pace is fast, and every possession matters. Clark was moving without the ball, not even directly involved in the play, just doing what elite players do. Creating space, reading the defense, and waiting for the next opportunity. And then out of nowhere, impact, a sudden, aggressive shoulder check, blindside. No play on the ball, no basketball move, just force, pure force. Clark hit the floor hard, and for a split second, everything froze. Players, fans, commentators, and even people watching at home, because everyone had the same thought at the exact same time. That didn't look right. Not just a foul, not just physical defense, something else, something that felt intentional. And within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Social media exploded. Replays slowed it down. Angles broke it apart frame by frame. And the more people watched it, the worse it looked because there was no confusion, no gray area. No, maybe it was just bad timing. It was clear. Clear enough that even casual fans, people who don't usually analyze plays, could see it. And that's when the conversation shifted completely. This wasn't about rookie struggles anymore. This wasn't about adjusting to the league. This was about something bigger. Because now the question wasn't, can Caitlin Clark handle the WNBA? The question became, why is she being treated like this? And once that question entered the conversation, everything changed because suddenly people started looking back, rewatching previous games, reanalyzing earlier moments, and connecting patterns that didn't seem obvious before. And what they found only made things more intense. It wasn't just one play. It wasn't just one player. It wasn't just one team. There was a pattern of physicality that felt different, more aggressive, more targeted, and more consistent than what most rookies experience. And now that people had seen that moment, they couldn't unsee it. Every screen looked harder. Every bump looked more deliberate. Every foul felt heavier. And whether that was reality or perception didn't even matter anymore, because perception had already taken over. The narrative was changing in real time. And once a narrative like that takes hold, it spreads fast. Really fast. Sports shows picked it up. Debates started. Former players weighed in. Some defended it, saying, "This is just how you test a star." Others questioned it, asking if this had gone too far. And fans were divided. Some saw it as toughness. Others saw it as targeting. Some called it competition. Others called it something much darker. And right in the middle of all of it was Caitlin Clark. Not saying much, not reacting dramatically, just getting up and continuing to play, which in a strange way made the moment even bigger, because there was no emotional outburst to distract from what happened. No dramatic response, no controversy from her side, just silence and performance. And that silence, it amplified everything. Because now the story wasn't just about what happened. It was about what it meant. Was this a message, a warning, a test, or something more coordinated than anyone wanted to admit? And then came the response that made things even worse. Because when people expected a strong reaction, a clear stance, a firm line being drawn, what they got instead felt underwhelming, muted, and almost hesitant. And that's when another question started to rise. Not just about players anymore, but about the system itself. Because if a moment that obvious, a moment that viral, a moment that intense didn't lead to a strong response, then what did that say? What did that reveal? Was the league trying to control the situation, downplay it, or avoid escalating it? Or were they comfortable with what was happening? And that question, that one uncomfortable question, is what pushed this story into a completely different territory. Because now it wasn't just about one hit or one game or one player. It was about whether something bigger was unfolding right in front of everyone. And once that idea started spreading, there was no going back. Because what people saw next didn't calm things down, it made everything even more complicated and way more intense. Because the deeper you looked, the more it felt like this wasn't just about physical play anymore. It was about something the league had been quietly dealing with for a long time. Something that had nothing to do with one foul, and everything to do with what Caitlin Clark represented, and why that might have made some people uncomfortable. But that's where the story takes an even sharper turn, because what started on the court was about to spill into something much bigger, much more sensitive, and far more explosive than anyone expected. After that moment, everything changed. Not just how people watched Caitlin Clark, but how they interpreted everything around her. Because now every game came with a different kind of attention. Not just excitement, not just curiosity, but scrutiny. Fans weren't just watching highlights anymore. They were watching behavior, watching reactions, watching body language, watching how players defended her, how referees called the game, and how commentators talked about her. And the more people paid attention, the more complicated the story became, because what they saw didn't always match the simple explanation everyone kept repeating. This is just how the league treats rookies. At some point, that explanation started to feel incomplete, because this wasn't just about being a rookie. This was about being her. And that distinction, that's where things started to get uncomfortable, because Caitlin Clark wasn't entering the league quietly. She wasn't building her name slowly. She didn't need years to become relevant. She arrived already being the biggest story in women's basketball. Already being the most talked about player. Already being the one people tuned in to see. And whether anyone said it out loud or not, that changes things. Because when someone arrives with that much attention, that much hype, that much spotlight, it doesn't just create opportunity. It creates pressure not just for them, but for everyone around them. And that's where the tension really started to build, because inside the league there were players who had spent years building this sport, grinding through seasons with less attention, less coverage and less recognition, carrying the league forward when nobody was watching. And now suddenly everything was changing faster than expected because of one player. And for some that didn't feel like progress. It felt like displacement. It felt like the spotlight they had earned was being redirected. And this is where the story gets complicated, because this wasn't just about jealousy. And it wasn't just about competition. It was about identity, about recognition, about legacy, about who gets credit, and who gets remembered. And when those things are involved, emotions run deeper than stats or wins ever could. You could hear it in the conversations, in interviews, and in subtle comments that didn't sound aggressive but carried weight. Statements like, "She's going to have to adjust. Things are different here. This isn't college anymore." On the surface, those sound normal, standard, and expected. But when you put them together, when you look at the timing, when you consider everything happening around her, they start to feel like something else. Less like advice, more like a warning. And then there was that one comment that stuck with everyone. "Reality is coming." 3 words. Simple but powerful. Because depending on how you heard it, it could mean 2 completely different things. On one side, it sounded like a veteran perspective. A reminder that the professional level is tougher, more physical, more demanding. But on the other side it sounded like something else, something colder. Something that hinted that what was coming wasn't just about basketball. And that's when the narrative took another turn. Because now people weren't just asking, "Is she being treated differently?" They were asking, "Why does this feel so personal?" Because that's what it started to feel like. Personal, not just competitive, not just strategic but emotional. And once that idea entered the conversation, everything got more intense, because now people started connecting different pieces of the puzzle. The physical play, the commentary, the reactions, the moments that didn't quite add up. And suddenly, what once looked like isolated incidents started to look connected. Now again, not everyone agreed. Some people pushed back hard, saying this was all being overanalyzed, that this is what happens when a player gets too much attention, that the spotlight itself was creating the illusion of conflict. And that's a fair argument, because when millions of people are watching every move, everything looks bigger, more dramatic, more significant. But here's the thing. Even if that's true, even if part of this is perception, perception still matters because perception shapes narratives and narratives shape reality. And right now, the narrative around Caitlin Clark was shifting fast. From rising star to controversial figure, from exciting rookie to central topic of debate, from player to symbol, a symbol of change, of tension, of a league trying to figure itself out in real time. And that's not a position most rookies ever find themselves in because usually a rookie is just trying to survive, trying to adjust, trying to earn respect. But Clark, she wasn't just adjusting to the league. The league was adjusting to her. And that kind of shift doesn't happen smoothly. It creates friction. It creates resistance. It creates moments where things don't align the way they're supposed to. And sometimes it leads to decisions that feel unexpected, confusing, or even controversial. Which is exactly what happened next. Because just as the conversation reached its peak, just as the debates got louder, just as the attention became impossible to ignore, a decision was made, not on the court, not during a game, but at the highest level of the sport. A decision that shocked fans, confused analysts, and made one thing very clear. Whatever was happening around Caitlin Clark, it wasn't slowing down. It was escalating. And what came next didn't just raise eyebrows. It made people seriously question who was really in control of this story. Just when it felt like the conversation couldn't get any louder, it did because everything that had been building, the tension, the debates, the questions, all of it was about to collide with one single decision. A decision that didn't happen on the court, didn't happen during a game, didn't involve a foul or a rivalry or a heated moment. This came from the top. From the people who decide who represents the United States on the biggest stage in sports, the Olympic team. And when the roster was announced, people weren't just surprised. They were stunned because Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on it. Not as a starter, not as a reserve, not even as a last-minute addition. She wasn't there at all. And for a moment, it didn't even make sense because this wasn't just any player being left off. This was the most talked about name in the sport. The player is drawing record attention. The one bringing new fans into the game. The one whose presence alone was shifting the entire landscape of women's basketball. And somehow she wasn't good enough. That's how it felt to a lot of people. Immediately, no delay, no hesitation. The reaction was instant. Social media exploded. Fans questioned everything. Analysts scrambled to explain it. And the more people tried to justify it, the more confusing it became, because the official reasoning on paper sounded logical. They talked about experience, about chemistry, and about having players who were already familiar with the system. Players who had been there before, who understood the structure, and who could fit into specific roles. And if you looked at it purely from a traditional standpoint, it made sense. That's how national teams usually operate. They rely on continuity, trust, and familiarity. But here's the problem. This wasn't a normal situation because Caitlin Clark wasn't a normal player. And that's what made the decision feel different. Because this wasn't about whether she could contribute. It was about what she represented. She wasn't just another option. She was the biggest draw in women's basketball. The one player who could bring global attention to the Olympic stage. The one player casual fans would tune in to watch. The one player who could expand the audience far beyond the usual reach. And yet she was left out, which led to one unavoidable question. Why? And that's where things started to get uncomfortable again. Because once people moved past the official explanation, they started looking for the real reason. And depending on who you asked, you got very different answers. Some said it was purely basketball, that she simply hadn't earned it yet. That experience matters. That you can't skip steps just because you're popular. Others saw it differently. They saw it as a message from the establishment, a way of saying, this league still has rules. This system still has a structure. You don't just walk in and take over. And whether that was true or not, that's how it felt because of everything that had already happened, because of the physicality, because of the commentary, because of the tension that had been building for weeks. This decision didn't exist in isolation. It felt connected, like another piece of the same story. And that's why the reaction was so strong, because fans weren't just reacting to the roster. They were reacting to what it symbolized to them. This wasn't just a selection decision. It was a statement, And the timing made it even more intense because this came right when Clark was at the center of everything. Right when the spotlight was brightest. Right when the debates were at their peak. And instead of that momentum carrying her forward, it felt like it hit a wall, a sudden stop, a moment where everything paused and people had to reassess what they were watching. Because now the story had changed again. This wasn't just about how players treated her, or how teams defended her. Now it was about how the system viewed her, and whether that system was fully ready for what she represented. Because here's the reality. Moments like this don't just affect one player. They shape narratives. They influence perception. They send signals to everyone watching. And the signal this sent was complicated. On one hand, it reinforced the idea that nothing is handed to you, that even the biggest star has to earn their place. But on the other hand, it raised doubts about whether performance and impact were being valued the same way, about whether certain players were being held to different standards, and about whether the league and the system around it were struggling to adapt to how fast things were changing. And those doubts, they didn't go away. They grew because the more people talked about it, the more layers they uncovered. And the more layers they uncovered, the less simple the story became, because now you had two competing narratives. One that said, "This is just how elite sports work," and another that said, "Something about this doesn't add up." And right in the middle of those two narratives was Caitlin Clark again, not responding emotionally, not escalating the situation, just continuing to play, continuing to perform, continuing to carry the weight of a conversation that kept getting bigger. And that might have been the most important part of all, because while everyone else was debating, she was moving forward, which in a strange way only made everything more intense, because now people weren't just watching what happened to her. They were watching how she handled it, and whether she would break under the pressure or rise through it. But while the outside world was focused on the Olympic decision, something else was happening, something quieter, less visible, but just as important. Because inside Indiana, inside the very organization built around her, the pressure was starting to build in a completely different way. And what happened next didn't involve a headline or a viral moment, but it revealed something just as powerful. Because sometimes the loudest decisions are the ones made in silence. While the outside world was arguing, debating, analyzing, and breaking down every foul, every decision, and every headline, something else was happening, something quieter, less visible, but far more important to Caitlin Clark's actual future. Because of all the noise, all the controversy, and all the attention, it didn't just stay online. It didn't just live in highlight clips and talk shows. It followed her straight into Indiana, into the locker room, into the practices, into every single moment behind the scenes. And that's where things started to feel different in a completely new way. Because now this wasn't just about proving herself against opponents. This wasn't just about handling pressure from fans or media. This was about something much closer, much more personal. This was about expectations. And expectations can be heavier than any defender. Because think about it. In a matter of months, the Indiana Fever went from being a rebuilding team, a team with modest expectations, a team quietly trying to find its identity, to becoming the center of the entire league. Every game mattered more. Every result felt bigger. Every mistake was amplified, not because of the team alone, but because of who was on it, Caitlin Clark. And when one player becomes the face of everything, it changes the dynamic whether people admit it or not. Because suddenly it's not just about winning games. It's about attention, about spotlight, about narratives forming around every interaction. And that kind of environment, it creates pressure in ways that don't always show up on the scoreboard. You could start to see it not in obvious conflicts, not in dramatic moments, but in subtle details, body language, spacing on the floor, and moments where things didn't quite click the way they should. And again, nothing clear enough to point to and say, "That's the problem," but enough to feel it. Enough to sense that something wasn't fully aligned yet. Because chemistry, real chemistry, doesn't just happen, especially not when everything changes overnight. And that's exactly what happened in Indiana. Because while Clark was adjusting to the league, the team was adjusting to her, adjusting to the pace, the style, the attention, the expectations, and that adjustment. It wasn't smooth. It couldn't be, because no team is built overnight. No system adapts instantly, and no locker room stays exactly the same when the spotlight suddenly shifts. And that's where things started to get complicated. because now there were multiple layers of pressure happening at the same time. Clark trying to prove herself, teammates trying to find their roles, coaches trying to balance development and results, and the organization trying to manage something it hadn't experienced before. A surge, a sudden rise, a spotlight that demanded answers immediately. And when all of that happens at once, it creates tension. Not always visible, not always spoken, but real. Because here's the truth. Most people don't talk about when a franchise changes this fast. Not everyone is comfortable. Not everyone adjusts at the same pace. And not everyone benefits in the same way. Some players get more attention. Some get less. Some roles expand, others shrink. And even if nobody says anything, that shift is felt. It's felt in the way players communicate, in the way decisions are made, and in the way the game flows. And for Indiana, that shift was happening in real time on national television, in front of millions of viewers every single night, which only made it harder because there was no time to figure things out quietly. No space to develop without scrutiny, no room for mistakes without consequences. Everything was being watched. Everything was being analyzed. Everything was being turned into a storyline. And in that kind of environment, even normal struggles start to feel like something bigger because people start asking questions. Questions like, why isn't the offense flowing? Why does the timing feel off? Why does it look like something's missing? And once those questions start, they don't stop. Because the more people look, the more they think they see. Patterns, moments, and details that may or may not mean something but feel important. And that's where the situation becomes dangerous. Not because something is definitely wrong, but because people believe something might be. And belief can shape narratives just as strongly as reality. And now the narrative around Indiana wasn't just about rebuilding anymore. It wasn't just about development. It was about expectation versus reality. About whether the team could match the level of attention it was receiving. About whether everything happening around Caitlin Clark was helping the team or quietly complicating things. And while all of that was building, something else was happening. Something that would shift the story once again. Because pressure doesn't just stay steady. It evolves. It grows. And sometimes it leads to moments no one sees coming. Moments that change the direction of everything. Because just when it felt like Indiana was trying to figure things out, the story took another turn. One that had nothing to do with controversy, nothing to do with debate, and everything to do with reality. Because no matter how big the spotlight is, no matter how strong the narrative becomes, there's one thing that can change everything instantly. And what came next was something no one wanted to see. Up until this point, everything about Caitlin Clark's story felt fast. Too fast. The rise, the attention, the pressure, the controversy. It all happened at a speed that almost didn't feel real. Like the league was trying to catch up to something it didn't fully understand yet. And in that kind of momentum, it's easy to forget something important.